John Kneubuhl, the greatest Samoan Welsh playwright in the world. There's a different title I've got here, which is also a portal to Oceanic modernism, if you want to get more academic about it. Co-sponsored by Hamilton Library, Conflict and Peace Specialist, Hui Aina Pilipili, Native Hawaiian Initiative, the School of Communication and Information, the School of Cinematic Arts, and the Departments of American Studies, Anthropology, English, Ethnic Studies, Political Science, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Okay, John Kneubuhl needs no introduction because that's what our speakers are going to do in their presentation. So I will confine my comments to the speakers themselves. But this puts me in a rather funny position, because what do you say about these two major figures in Hawaii's literary, performance, cultural, and historical scene? I have known Jackie Pualani Johnson for at least 25 years as a theater educator, director, and actor, and as the voice talent for the Biography Hawaiʻi documentary on Maikiʻaiu Lake. She has been a defining figure on Kumoku o Keawe as the director of the theater program within the Performing Arts Department at University of Hawaii at Hilo, where she taught for 38 years, and as an ubiquitous performer, writer, director, and producer of that island's community theater scene. She was a co-founder of the Hilo Community Players Shakespeare in the Park, which is coming up on its 48th year, with occasional forays and tours over to other islands like this one. She is also a prolific creator of living history programs. Most pertinently for today's talk, she also provided an artistic home for John Kneubuhl and has written compellingly about her experiences with him. As for Victoria Nalani Kneubuhl, I'll start with some template. As a playwright, she has published 2 collections. The plays in Hawaii Nei, Island Plays from 2002, are all set in this Pai'aina. The plays in Navigating Islands, Plays from the Pacific, published this year, are all partially or entirely set in Samoa. These collections reflect Victoria Kneubuhl's own Hawaiian Samoan ancestry, and she even manages to get a couple of German characters into her plays as well. Her many plays have been performed in Hawaii and elsewhere for at least 45 years. As a scriptwriter and co-producer, she was responsible for 5 documentaries in the Biography Hawaiʻi series, several other full-length documentaries, including the recently broadcast story of Aquan McElrath, and 20 shorter documentaries and training films commissioned by the Center for Labor, Education, and Research and the University of Hawaii at West Oahu and Department of Education. She has been a prolific writer of living history plays. The Beginning of a Garden featured 3 of the most important figures in the history of Foster Botanical Gardens and will be performed at the Gardens next weekend, and she plays Mary Foster. Her most sustained living history collaboration has been with the Hawaii Ponui Coalition. In addition to Ke Kaua o Kala'ui, The Life of Prince Jonah Kuhio Kalaniane'ole, currently running at the Kamehameha V Judiciary History Center, including tonight, she created 3 commemorative productions in the 1990s that are still regularly performed as part of the Maipuina Never Forget series. She has also published a trilogy of Hawaii mystery novels set in the 1930s, Murder Casts a Shadow, Murder Leaves Its Mark, and Murder Frames the Scene. Her short story, Ho'ululahui, has been republished twice, drawing special attention as a work of Hawaiian speculative fiction, and I know she has a Samoan novel currently under editorial review. She has served as Distinguished Writer-in-Residence in this Department of English here at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, and 2 terms on the Board of Trustees for the Hawaiian Historical Society. Her contributions to Hawaii literature were recognized in 2006 with the Elliott Cades Award for Literature, which joined her 1994 Hawaii Award for Literature, the state's highest acknowledgement for artistic achievement. On a very personal note, I have known Vicki for at least 38 years. I have acted in her plays, worked with her on a variety of grants, co-produced a documentary series with her and Joy Chong Stannard, written the foreword for both of her play collections, and I believe introduced her more than any other human being. So, I'm always glad to talk about her at length, which I already have. But in closing, all I will say is that our collaborations and her friendship have, for me, been among the greatest and most valuable gifts I have received in my life. Jacqueline Pualani Johnson and Victoria Nalani Kneubuhl on John Kneubuhl.
lava, aloha kako, ia o ko kabelina o ka ua na ulu e ki ko'o aku nei me ke aloha.
Aloha kako. Mahalo na ka hoʻokipa mai I ke la, nā kumu o ke kula nui o manoa, koʻu mau hoa aloha, ma ka wā mamo I hina nei, to the teachers and the staff, ke kahi mau mea hana I leo. We welcome all of you. Some friends from our online play reading group too. So we appreciate that they are with us today. Aloha I hope ke kahi. Wonderful to have everyone here, and Victoria's daughter. Now the reason why this slide is up here, please know, this is John's sense of humor. He characterized himself in an interview as the greatest Samoan Swiss Welsh playwright in the world. The problem was the interviewer didn't know he was making a humorous moment of the introduction. But it sets the tone for the range of his work. He was as hilarious at times as he was as deep and informing, and his work will speak for itself when we get to share it now. And we have a mention to everyone, if we for some reason get too quiet, let us know, give us a high sign to get louder, please. Okay. Mahalo, Caroline, Keone as well. So, aloha kako, and we are going to be sharing, and the official title that was given to you, John Alexander Kneubuhl, A Portal to Oceanic Modernism, o manino le mato o le vai, the spring water is clear. We would especially like to thank Craig. I appreciate him as an actor too, because he was wonderful in staging John Kneubuhl's works not too long ago. And the Center for Biographical Research for inviting us here to share the life of this playwright, screenwriter, and educator. We call this the handsome John Kneubuhl. My life's work was changed by John Alexander Kneubuhl. It all began when he was introduced to us at the University of Hawaiʻi at Hilo in the 1980s. A tall, lanky, toothless, brown-skinned, white-haired, eloquent man who understood the power of theater as the means of dissecting our human stories and breathing new life into them. Best of all, it was our life in the Pacific, our beliefs, our histories, our spiritual connection to our ancestors that John focused upon. It was like bursting through the surface of a deep body of water to gasp and breathe new understandings, new relevancies, a rebirth. We were now on stage.
I'm the niece of John Alexander Kneubuhl, and I'm also a playwright and an author. And as a beginning playwright, it was really encouraging to know that someone in my family was standing behind me and had done this kind of work so successfully. It was also very strengthening to know that my own kupuna that I loved and respected had lived and promoted the same values that I so wanted to reflect in my own work. They were for him, and they are for me, a social and political conscience, a firm belief that our stories as Indigenous Pacific Islanders have meaning and are more than worth telling, a love of theatricality and the spirit of fun, a recognition of ancestral presence, and the enduring conviction that theater is a sacred space in our lives. Also, John played a crucial role in establishing modernism and postmodernism in Pacific Island literature, and even his very early work examines the insecurities, disorientation, and fragmentation of our cultures brought on by colonization. So Jackie and I decided, because we both love living history and primary source material, to feature John's own voice and words, not only for the information, but as a way for you to get to know him. So whenever you hear us reading in the first person, it's his words and not ours. In our research, we found that over and over again, John referred to his relationship with his elders and his ancestors. It was a relationship he carried with him throughout his life, and we wanted to open this talk with what he had to say about that ancestral relationship and his compulsion to be a writer.
So this is where we begin hearing John's voice. As young men, we were raised to serve our elders. Later, when we were a bit older, we served our village chiefs twice every Sunday, church and church. As a boy, I would be thanked and complimented by the old chiefs for this or that chore well done. I can still hear their voices, and I can still remember the feelings of deep satisfaction in me when I had served well. But you see, all of these old people are dead now. And although I can still vaguely hear their voices, I don't know what they're saying anymore. I miss their approval. I think that's where the compulsion comes.
And John said in a radio interview, circa 1970, of their world, the one that's just beyond the touch of the living, it is a very sobering lesson for anyone to be taught that man just doesn't own nature, that he's really only part of a larger world, and that forces from the largeness, from beyond his immediate horizons, can break in and interpenetrate with this world, and in fact they do so all the time, every hour, every minute, every second.
Working to gain approval of my dead. Of course, you'll never get it, not in this life, but still, you work for it. At least I do. John was born in 1920 on the island of Tutuila in American Samoa to a mother who was 3/4 Samoan and an American father. On his father's side, he was descended from Benjamin Franklin Kneubuhl, born in Iowa, a second-generation American whose parents were Swiss. Benjamin's father may have been a baker. After his father died, Benjamin left home, lied about his age, joined the Navy, and eventually got stationed in American Samoa, where he met Atalina Pritchard. The Navy would not allow him to marry her because she was Samoan, and he had to return after his Navy duty to wed her. His mother's genealogy intersected many islands, many countries.
Atalina Pritchard was the daughter of Lemusu Fuiaba Ili Ili of Salailua, Savaii, and Alfred James Pritchard. Alfred James Pritchard was an Afakasi born in New Zealand who moved back to Samoa when he was 3 years old. Alfred's mother was Atalina Baker. Atalina Baker was one of the first Afakasi children in Samoa. Her mother, Vaimanu Leatawa, was from the island of Manono, and her father, John Baker, the harbor pilot in Apia. Alfred's father, George Pritchard Jr., was born in Tahiti, the son of notorious Protestant minister and British consul, George Pritchard.
John grew up living above the family store in Whangatombo and in Leone Village, where he often resided with his grandfather. John's father was a successful businessman, and his mother was a refined Samoan woman who had attended school in New Zealand and loved art and music and literature. John attended the Marist Brothers School, but spent much of his time at his grandfather's house in the village of Leone. It was in Leone Village, at the feet of the village chiefs and orators, that he refined his Samoan language skills and was immersed in Samoan culture. In Leone, John was exposed to faleaitu, the Samoan comedic performance genre that greatly influenced John's writings.
The faleaitu players who visited from Western Samoa performed at night by torchlight in the great meeting huts of the nearby villages. We would walk there shortly after dusk, men, women, and children, and return long after midnight, having laughed our village lives back to sanity and tolerance of human weakness in ourselves and in others. Samoan politics were also a topic of conversation, with for village elders.
I was almost 10, and my childhood hero, Tamasese, had just been assassinated by the New Zealand administration over in Western Samoa. He was my mother's beloved cousin, and his death broke her spirit for many years. She sat alone a great deal, sipping tea and picking at her endless fruitcake, and from time to time weeping softly to herself. I withdrew into books and solitary games. Many, many years later, while I was going through an intensive daily psychoanalysis, the doctor pointed out that I had had a severe breakdown. Sometime around my birthday, and nobody paid any attention, my mother thought me merely moody and saw to it that I had a little glass of port wine every day. I was moved out to her father's house in the old village of Leone, where my Samoan side took over. I think that saved me from deterioration into more severe schizophrenia. I played with my village cousins and eavesdropped on Grandpa and the village chiefs, gossiping at dusk about the villagers' religious day and inevitably about Tamasese's cruel death in the Western Samoans' non-violent struggle for political freedom and independence from the New Zealand government. Leone Village was also the scene of a traumatic moment that had reverberations for John throughout his life. One of the village chiefs took him aside and asked him who he loved more, his mother or his father, expecting he would say his mother. John lamented.
Because when you say, whom do you love, your Samoan mother or your Pualani father, what you are asking the poor child to do is to choose between two cultures and two parents, each one representing a different culture. And you're asking the child to choose between father and mother, being Pualani, being Samoan, and it was a devastating thing to do.
When he was 14, John was sent away to Honolulu, as his two other brothers had been, to attend Punahou School. He was a brilliant student, excelling in music and on the track field. He had aspirations to become a composer and pianist, and to this end, when he graduated from Punahou in 1938, he applied to and was accepted at Yale University. This is John in his yearbook. And of course, this is one of his contemporaries, one of his friends who wrote the little paragraph there. Kneubuhl belongs to a category of his own. One would normally classify him as an artist, a creator. He can draw the soul out of a piano and splash a canvas with brilliance. But this young phenomenon is also star hurdler and captain of the track team. Last year, he headed the class as president and joined the Hawaiʻi. When barbaric Samoan tendencies break out, Johnny dashes after Deverell, recites mad poetry, startling quotations, and manifests himself in drama. Note the period costumes there. A prediction, Kneubuhl the great pianoski. On his journey to the East Coast and his new life at an Ivy League university, he wrote, "I saw our town on my way to Yale. Something about Thornton Wilder's approach to theater went to the quick. I am still reeling. Soon after, I got to know and learn from Thornton. And milky pink marbles, which began pelting me, have grown into a blizzard. I went to Yale intending to major in music, and theater was far from my mind." My composition teacher, Paul Hindemith, suggested that perhaps music had been a wrong road turned on to when I was 12 years old. He did not think much of my talent for composing. The next year I applied for acceptance into Walter Pritchard Eaton's Workshop 7. the introductory class to his famous 47 workshop. As the Yale Drama School was a graduate school, and I was an undergraduate, there was real doubt in my mind that I would be accepted. But I was. And Paul Hindemith was right. I was home, and more free than I'd ever been in my life. Hog-tied free. The work John did at the 47 workshop was nurtured by notable theater practitioners of the time, whose contributions were cutting edge, controversial, and revolutionary. The founder, George Pierce Baker, and Professor Walter Pritchard Eaton, as well as playwright teacher Thornton Wilder, put John through rigorous training. The workshop was designed so that playwrights would be at all rehearsals, make suggestions, sometimes take charge of rehearsals. There was total dedication to seeing that the work reached a gratifying end, but only in the estimation of the writer, who was considered the final judge, jury, creator, all of those things. 400 people were vetted to be allowed to see the plays, and each person was required to hand in signed, written commentary within a week. Playwrights consider the criticisms in refining their work. A dream scenario, perhaps, for a writer? Truly a laboratory, where elements of structure, theme, delivery, and emphasis were hashed, refined, given subtlety, brought to life. At the core, no waiting years to get your work before an audience. Success was a typical outcome, with people like Eugene O'Neill, Thomas Wolfe, and Philip Barry reaching a great notoriety after the 47 workshop.
We recently performed excerpts from 3 extant plays from John's years as a student at Yale at the Oceanic Popular Culture Symposium at Chaminade University. One of them was Folktale, a fantasy in 1 act that began as an opera libretto but was rewritten and became the piece he wrote as an application to the drama school. Saint Mac is a play set in a Samoan village and concerns a religious con artist. And The Sunset Crowd is set in a Samoan bar and about dreams, lost souls, and the search for home.
This is a letter note that John wrote in the summer of 1941 to his girlfriend, Dorothy Skank of Oahu. She was otherwise known as Dotsie. It reveals that what concerned him at the time as a very young man, the rapacious changes in Samoa due to Western influence, military presence, and the cultural losses of all Polynesians. These issues fuel the themes in his play, The Sunset Crowd.
Dotsie. Every day a new village is bought up. The villagers sent into the mountains and machinery of war built up where the village stood. The natives, at 60 to 80 cents an hour, help to build it, loving the cash across their palms. They know that in 5 years what they are building will come to an end and will be one of the many symbols of man's incomparable stupidity. They know that their old life is gone forever. Young kids of 13 and 14 who last year spoke no English, lived their own way, and were the happiest young people in the world, now have grown up with a remarkable speed. They drink, gamble, have mistresses, get into man-killing brawls, speak a filthy brand of English. And do they think it disgusting? Oh no, they're only being like the smart white men who come down to show them all of these things. They adore the sailors, marines, and contractors who have seen New York and all them places, know the scores, and make Samoa one New York too.
But I think I know now how the early missionaries got the upper hand over the Hawaiians. How this influx of Western culture, has gotten the upper hand here in Samoa, with such amazing rapidity? It is through a debasing or complete annihilation of the past. The early missionaries in Hawaii did it by debasing a temporarily sterile but potentially good native religion. They called it pagan, condemned the kahunas, burned the idols, etc., etc. It was very effective. The modern conversion of Samoa is done along the same lines. A code of laws recently passed prohibits the teaching of native chants or native mythology in any of the villages without the approval of the local government. Prohibits the use of any language but English in the schools, etc. Result? Not one. Not one Dotsie of the native chiefs knows anything about his past. Pick any name from Samoan history, and it has been a glorious past. Ask the smartest young Samoan to identify it, and he cannot do it. But he will readily tell you that George Washington and Lincoln were the greatest men that ever lived. They had their own equivalent of Lincoln. She was a woman, Salamasina, who freed them almost single-handedly from a 200-year tyrannical rule by the Tongans.
And one might ask, just what the past has to do with the present. After all, dead men are dead, and we are alive today, etc., etc., and etc. Yet, I am now convinced that no change can be effective without a feeling of one's heritage to guide one in evaluating the elements of change. John's play, The Sunset Crowd, was produced at Yale University in 1942, just before John graduated. It marked the first time in the Yale Drama School history that an undergraduate had been given a major production. The play was a huge success and received a rave review from Howard Marshall Holtzman. He wrote,
"The play produced was an imaginatively moving one, and there was the added excitement of welcoming a new playwright of powerful artistry into the ranks of the theater's more sincere practitioners. Mr. Kneubuhl has written no ordinary play, although what he has to tell is indeed quite simple. The burden of it is that human beings are both great and terrible creatures, while in the grip of strong passions. Mr. Kneubuhl has the eye and comprehension of a poet, and is concerned not with the guts of his characters, but with their souls. To put dream sequences on a stage and to match them credibly with scenes of actuality is a ticklish task. But the new playwright knows the craft demands of his medium, as well as he knows the depths of human character."
John graduated in 1942. He and his fiancée, Dorothy Schenck, were immediately married. World War II was in full swing, and John went straight into naval intelligence. When discharged, he and Dotsie came back to Honolulu, and in 1946, he worked as the assistant director for the Honolulu Community Theater. He threw himself into creating a local theater and playwriting movement that included all the people of Hawaii and their representation on stage. His landmark plays and his feature film during this period of his life would be the seeds of inspiration that blossomed during the 1970s into a revival of local theater that is now a permanent and vital part of our community.
The plays he wrote during this period were The Harp and the Willows, about missionary Lorenzo Lyons and his music, and Grave Robin and other issues. The play featured many native Hawaiians and large blocks of dialogue, Ika Olelo Hawaii, in Hawaii. The City is Haunted, which exposed Honolulu's post-war guilt, and the prevalent economic inequalities between the rich and the working classes of Hawaii. The Sound of Hunting, an adaptation of Harry Brown's play about World War II, featuring Japanese American soldiers from the 442nd Infantry, and Point Distress, a lost script, perhaps having to do with red baiting and McCarthyism, prevalent during his time, yes? He also wrote and directed Damien, a feature film on the life of Father Damien, perhaps the first feature-length film to be written and directed by a Pacific Islander.
In a newspaper article of the time entitled "Letter to a Broadway Playwright," ostensibly written to Harry Brown, John articulated his ideas about local theater.
Many of us do not like the standardized assembly line societies in which everyone is precisely like everyone else. And many of us applaud the differences that exist in our island life. You miss the rich texture of human beings if you deny their cultural differences. And we hope honestly for a theater wherein the creative expression of any group will remain true to its own heritage, and yet such an intensity of expression that it automatically becomes fruitful for all other races. Above its physical beauties, the real worth of Hawaii lies in its rich interplay of various races and cultures. And incidentally, it also belies the common misconception of Hawaii as one of those places where the imagination and creative energy are lulled into apathy. Warm climate, exotic surroundings, steel guitar sentimentalities. Hawaii, as you well know, is a complex crisscross of cultural units, energetically, amicably striving for expression and recognition, and that will always save her from cultural atrophy. The thing that worries you is that you've heard these progressive dreams before. They all came to nothing, didn't they? But Harry, the difference between those plans you've heard before and ours is that whereas they were the impractical romanticism of sincere men, our plans that are born out of social necessity. The society we live in here is dictating invisibly, but irrevocably, almost each one of our next moves. Only the insensitive and the culturally blind would deny that we're being pushed into a new and exciting kind of theater, and that our decision is born out of a real social need here.
We have here, Harry, something you will never get out of your dislocated life in New York. We have the rich heritage of many cultures, the fullest appreciation of myth, legend, and history, and a fresh new field of artistic and social material which has not been standardized and crippled by precedent. We can have a truly fine theater, Harry. We will.
There is John at work. Unable to support himself as a theater artist, John Kneubuhl found himself in Hollywood in 1950. He became a successful and sought-after writer for television, and for the next 20 years, he wrote over 100 scripts that were produced. He wrote for many of the popular television series, including Gunsmoke, The Fugitive, Adventures in Paradise, Ironsides, and The Wild Wild West, and many more, too numerous to mention. But eventually, he became unfulfilled as a writer and fed up with the bourgeois Los Angeles lifestyle, so he moved back to Samoa in 1969.
I couldn't take it anymore. I had to satisfy my own needs, which were and still are the voices of my dead. I've always thought that the most important thing a writer can do through language is to make new metaphors which serve as new homes for our dead among the living. It was to make such metaphors, or to find them, that I left Hollywood.
Back home, the Pearl of the Pacific, yes. He helped found the American Samoan Community College and threw himself into education as a teacher and curriculum developer. But after all that experience, this blank canvas to be filled, he became an early and very fierce advocate for bilingual, bicultural education, and he so enjoyed being home again. We put in that enjoyment slide.
Well, remember now, I was an English teacher at the college. I began to push for a number of things. That Samoan, our own language, be used as the language of instruction, and for a very practical reason. Over 90% of the college students didn't know enough English to learn in English, and the students knew nothing about Samoan history, absolutely nothing, and very little about the deeper implications of the culture they were living daily, the Samoan culture. When I brought these things up to the authorities, it was as if I was advocating communism. The reaction was firm, adamant, and unyielding. English. You can only be good Americans if you learn English. Of course, nobody was saying that our young people shouldn't learn English, far from it. But an educational problem and educational goal, learning, was immediately subverted, perverted into a political problem. It's really racism when you deny a people the very foundation of their identity, their language, and their history, and insist that yours is superior and therefore should supplant theirs. So I was faced with a vast prejudice against the very things that make me not just a teacher, but a human being.
My push got nowhere. An adamant opposition faced me, and if I continued at the college, it would mean being trapped in a situation that was even more antagonistic, even more destructive to my identity and creative growth than Hollywood could ever have been. I left Hollywood because it was killing me creatively and therefore as a person. But that's only me, one person. And here I was at a college that I'd helped start to help our young people, and it was clear to me that if I continued, I would be contributing to the death of a language, a history, of culture. So I quit. That was in May of 1972.
John went to Tonga for a year and then came to Honolulu and taught at Leeward Community College. In 1975, he was asked to return to American Samoa by the Department of Education to head a bilingual, bicultural project for the elementary and high school system. I should add that he wrote the grant for that project too. He jumped at the chance only to find on his return that the governor, appointed by the U.S. Department of the Interior, refused to sign his contract and began a libelous campaign of character assassination against him. Undaunted, John went to work for the DOE as a volunteer for a year. The program continued to be a political issue and was never fully instituted by the DOE, but as John states, the work was not in vain. As the words swirling around his image attest, speak, proud, courage, strong, family, ancestry.
It has been a partial success in terms of results. It has been a great success in one vital area, our people, especially our teachers, are beginning increasingly aware of the central position in our lives that our language has. And there is a kind of a new tenacity with which Samoans are beginning to insist on retaining their culture. A great deal of that has been brought about by the everyday pressures of a bicultural society, like Samoa. Some of that pressure is threatening. How far, for instance, do we apply the American Constitution to American Samoa? The bilingual, bicultural program has helped to focus attention on our language and its importance in our children's learning and on our social structure and culture, our poems, our history, our stories. There's a renaissance of human awareness everywhere, of the dignity and worth and value of each people's human voice. I think we are becoming more and more aware that once that voice is lost, the world of man will have lost something sacred, unique, and irreplaceable.
After purging his TV trauma by dramatically setting fire to his Hollywood screenplays in his backyard, John returned to his love of writing for the theater. The plays he created in his final years are a testament to his love for his adopted homeland, Hawaii, and his utter devotion to his Samoan heritage. Among them was Hello, 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 written in 1973, where Hawaiian elders shape and create their own reality. There was more creativity on the horizon as he rediscovered his stage roots.
As I mentioned earlier, John began a relationship with the University of Hawaii at Hilo, which happens to be my hometown and where I was a professor of drama. First, he directed Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? Edward Albee's 1962 drama. That was in 1987 that he directed that. He followed that by Our Town in 1990. Both plays showcased his knowledge of iconic American drama. Our Town was his mentor, Thornton Wilder's memorable treatise on small-town America, and Virginia Woolf serves as a study of dysfunctional marital relationships. I had the good fortune of appearing as Martha, there I am, in Virginia Woolf, with beloved island actor, the late Peter Charlot, as George, and we both grew so much under John's tutelage and humor.
Published in 1997 by the University of Hawaii Press, a trilogy of John's plays became available to the world. Melikani Kau, which was written in 1975 and haunted by a kumuhula. A Play, written in 1989 and performed at UH Hilo to an audience mesmerized by John's theatricality, including a Madame Pele, a true Kino Lau shapeshifter who mourned the passing of the old ways.
It seemed that being back in the Pacific fed John's certainty that the theater was the way to explore all the issues of identity, cultural salvation, and the influence of ancestors as spiritual entities in our lives today.
Uncle John's final work codified his experiences, his family influences, his instincts, and his vision for the Pacific, where the majesty of Polynesian culture exists. Think of a Garden was finished in 1991 and published in his UH Press trilogy. It was also performed in Auckland in 1993, Wellington in 1994, and in Honolulu in 1995, pictured here where I'm trying to be my grandmother. Uncle John died in American Samoa in 1992, and on the night he died, the first production of this last and most biographical play, Think of a Garden, was being performed just down the road.
In closing, we would like to leave you with two final thoughts from John Alexander Kneubuhl. The first is a response to a question John was asked about whether being an Afakatse, born of two cultures, was a hindrance or a help to him as a writer.
You already have an advantage, a valuable asset as a human being. You're able to look at anything from two totally different perspectives. It is a matter of ambiguity, of being able to see more than one meaning in any one thing, a richness of interpretation. But then I think there is also a kind of naivete, an emotional innocence underlying that talent for the ambiguous. That's crucial to a playwright. Your feelings, your sensitivities are very close to the surface. You wear your heart on your sleeve. You try to hide it, of course. You put on the mask of sophistication, but the mask is tissue thin. You are almost painfully sensitive to human beings, especially to their hurts. I have all of that from my Samoan upbringing.
This closing section is from a letter John wrote to Victoria. When he found out that she had taken up playwriting, he wrote that to her. And though it was written to her, we feel it applicable to any indigenous writer, especially those from Oceania who decide to tell their stories through writing and performance. I welcome you to Thespis' gang with delight and with pride. I hope your play gets produced responsibly soon, and that I get to read it. Today we seem to be disloyal and amoral camp followers who will sleep with the armies of either side. But remember that we began as oracles and priests, as conjurers of our dead ancestors' spirits. We are essentially holy. So although they may love us for our bodies, it is really our voices they yearn for. What begins with pleasure ends in awe. What is manifest play is latent mystery. Find your own voice and honor it. The words that give it body are sacred. Don't let the good fun of doing a play allow you to be seduced by others, directors, actors, well-meaning friends, into easy compromises. Remember that your play is always at bottom an act of worship, your act of worship. Screw everybody. It's your voice. Sing your song. Wohohoi. We have a number of playwrights in our audience too, so those last words are even more meaningful with them here.
And we definitely have time for questions and comments, so I'll just open it up to the floor.
Right. I was curious, Vicki, did you go to California, Hollywood, when your dad went?
When my uncle was
Excuse me,
living there, I was at his house in Brentwood right at the end of his Hollywood years when he was thinking about moving to Samoa. I think it was like 1967, 68. And so I do remember going to his house in Brentwood and him, he had a typewriter. He worked on a typewriter. He was out by the swimming pool like typing away. And then he told me, God, someday I'm going to get too drunk, I'm going to fall in the swimming pool, I'm going to die, and they're going to write a screenplay about this.
I want to add to that because you mentioned the pool. One of the stories that John loved to tell, many of us remember Wild Wild West. And one of the main characters was the little person in Wild Wild West. So John said it was a Sunday when no one was supposed to be working and he was enjoying refreshment at the side of the pool. And the phone rang, and they said, John, we need to do something to enliven this. He had his story about it. So in his witty moment, he said, throw in one of those dwarfs, see what happens. And it became one of the most incredible villains ever in the Wild Wild West series. Off the cuff that way, yeah.
Mike, the way he was living in Brentwood in Hollywood, and the way he was living in Samoa when he moved there, it's like, the difference in those worlds is just incredible.
Separate planets.
Yeah, universes.
But that Samoa always drew him back. And all of his plays have that deep, deep connection to that life and values.
Since we're talking about his time in Hollywood, I'm curious to know, because you mentioned how he burned his scripts and sort of cured his trauma. And I've also learned from you that also during this time, it's during the Cold War. And so certain kinds of messages are themselves being, or even certain writers are being blacklisted. And I'm just curious to know, because when he's in Hawaii, he's also writing about the Cold War.
Yeah.
Studious Haunted is 2 weeks after John and Aiko Reinecke are
Yeah.
fired.
Yeah.
And so the Cold War seems to be haunting all of that, and that's very Manichaean, like it's very binaristic. And there seems to be that kind of duality that's happening that he's kind of wrestling with. And I'm just kind of curious to know, like, why was that so traumatic for him? Was it a combination of being so isolated and perhaps the racism of Hollywood or California? But I guess kind of curious to get a better sense as to like why it was such a harsh reaction, that he felt like he needed to burn everything. And,
Yeah, you know, I mean, honestly, Dean, one of the things I think is that there's kind of a lot of pressure on these Apakasi boys to be successful. And, you know, he was, I mean, he was kind of socially successful in the theater here after the war, but he wasn't making any money, and my grandfather was kind of bankrolling him. And when he gets to Hollywood, he becomes successful pretty quickly, and he starts making all this money, and I think it was kind of really seductive for him to be that successful, especially, you know, and his father was like, oh, you know, look at my son, he said, making all this money. But then I think he just realized how it took so much away from him. You know, and he's even said, you know, sometime later that he wished he never left Hawaii, even though he was poor here in the theater, that he wished he never left the theater scene. And so I think that you know, being there just really, you know, was kind of like this amputation, a big part of himself. But, you know, there is another play, I don't know if I sent it to you, Max 1950, where he's really writing about the Cold War and about, you know, red baiting and things that were going on in Hollywood at that time when he got there. And I remember once he did say that a lot of the writers, they take these jobs and they, you know, farm them out to the blacklisted writers that weren't getting any work.
And not that John didn't try in Hollywood. He often put Polynesian characters in his work for all these television series and everything too. But it still wasn't enough to fulfill that need he had. Yeah. But that's a groundbreaking thing that is possible at that time, to have Polynesians featured, and not just the cliched type of Polynesian. He tried to have authenticity, or they were symbolic of some of the things that identity rose in his worldview.
You just talked, I mean, Denny's here, or whatever. I know one of the things that people think about very strongly about John is his role as sort of a kupuna for Pacific playwriting and Pacific writing and whatever. Can you just talk about what kind of an influence, what kind of a teacher or a mentor, or Billy could probably answer some of this as well too, but just how did he sort of inspire or influence the writers who then came along afterwards? Because I know an awful lot of them mentioned they crossed his path at one point or another.
Well, for me, part of it was his courage. Nalani Kneubuhl was courageous way before Merry Monarch folks. He was featuring a halau and questionable things about how people were servicing the cliche in Waikiki, cellophane hula skirts, coconut bras that were not like the real coconut bras, and that kind of. So I felt his courage was very instructive. And of course, that we local people, and I'm sure across the Pacific too, mesmerized by seeing our stories on stage. It hadn't been done to that extent that Uncle John did. But with this level of writing too, not simplistic, complex characters. And some of the ways that he approached the structure, he often had the writer in his plays addressing the audience, giving context for what was on stage. So it was cutting edge in terms of, you know, drama theory. He wasn't doing these old-fashioned domestic plays that you just watch a story of a family in the Pacific. He pushed the edges of how the stories are being told. So that was exciting for younger playwrights who didn't want to just be old-fashioned in style. So those two things really stuck out for me. Really, probably has specifics as well.
I want to say that John Kneubuhl did influence The Last Virgin in Paradise in a big way. You know, that I wrote with Emerita. I don't think I would have written that had I not met him, because I hadn't done anything that crazy before. But I mean, one of the things that John said that I still remember today is the fact that if you want to be in theater, you have a responsibility to be theatrical. So his plays were kind of over the top, you know, they were larger than life. And one of the things he said was, why would people want to go to the theater to see just a reflection of real life? They just go to the marketplace or go to town and see that. They go to theater to see, you know, like something much bigger and different from real life, though it might draw from real life. And then, of course, you know, his views on the Hawaiʻi and the fluidity of the Samoan clown figure, you know, the Faluma, and the liminality of that character was very fascinating. He was playing with gender fluidity way before, you know, his time, and really pushing boundaries. But so yeah, I'd like to give tribute and acknowledge that influence on my work. But I wanted to go back a bit to his time in Hollywood, where he was being hired to write for TV and to push narratives of white supremacy. Part of the reason why after all those years he felt that he had kind of lost his way, and how that affected him personally and emotionally, which led to his desire to leave Hollywood and go back to Samoa. So he was a pioneer. He was doing that way before people like Taika Waititi, who's now there. Rena Owen has moved there to Hollywood. Lita Mahori, who did Once Were Warriors, went to Hollywood, and then he's gone back, supposedly, you know, having lost his soul. Then there's Cliff Curtis, you know, and so you have this Maori actors and directors who have been seduced by Hollywood and were seduced, and I'm just wondering whether John's story would seem to suggest that it is not possible to be in Hollywood and to be part of this machine, this very racist, kind of oppressive machine, and not become part of it. And I'm just wondering whether you know of any instances where people have gone and worked for this machine of just churning out scripts and, you know, films or whatever, and not become kind of consumed by it. Do you know if there?
I don't know, but I do know, you know, that when he went there, television was fairly new. You know, it was kind of like a new thing, and they were figuring out how to make it this business, you know, so he was kind of getting in that industry on the ground floor in the very early 50s. But I just don't see how, I mean, because in his heart, he was not a commercial writer, you know, and I think in order to be there, you just have to be, that's what, you know, you kind of have to not want to be the kind of writer he wanted to be.
I think he tried to address that desire to insert his identity into those scripts through the creation of the dwarf, Miguelito Loveless. Could you talk a little bit about that?
If you have, do you have specifics?
No, he did say that stuff about how that character was, you know, kind of like him. He identified with that character.
there's a lot of instances where the loss he saw in Samoa, really, that exact plot line is put into some of his Hollywood stories. You know, someone colonizing the less worthy in their estimation, you know, that type of thing. So I think he did some direct transference of what he understood. Remember we saw the machine gun and all that kind of, I'm sorry if I misidentified what that military gun was. But, you know, all of that was there from his experience as a young man, and then he saw that happening to his own place, and then he took that and put that in a lot of the scripts, so it does appear, it comes up quite a bit. And, you know, is the treatment of the underdog that comes up in a lot of his things. But then he also questions the sincerity of institutions, and that comes up in both in his drama and in his TV work. You know, what is the reliable source? A lot of his plays has the questionable character that, under a ruse of some kind, either religion or a history or whatever, they're trying to manipulate other people and advance themselves. Right? So all of these things seem to wind through his life as a child, his relationship on the East Coast, went to school, he saw certain things, brought him back. He was never disconnected from anything. He kept channeling all of those rivers into one valley of creativity, I think. Yeah. And one of the things we haven't mentioned that other people who are on our monthly play reading, we have often used the term Kneubuhlesque, that certain things are Kneubuhlesque, is what John did and what actually Victoria does a great deal too, is that there's one foot in this reality and the other foot in the spiritual. And they're not separate entities. You wend back and forth, you kind of filter through, etc. I've seen that in young writers' works like Sean Joseph Truitt here, you know. That quality is there in your work too, Daniel Akiyama. You know, that other world that exists, and John, that's called the Va, and John spoke about that in many instances. So that's also something, and I think he played, we didn't list all of his work. Some of the spooky things that were happening in Hollywood at the time, you know, those series, what were the series that, Twilight Zone and all that kind of things. They started playing with that kind of reality as well. So I think John had that influence among his group of writers.
I can just say one thing and then I'll shut up.
No,
I'm fascinated with the dwarf that John created while he was writing TV, and how he used the dwarf as a sort of alter ego to speak back to power. So he would have these episodes where the dwarf would say something about all the land that
you're on the side of the dwarf.
Yeah,
That's right.
Yeah.
But the other thing I find fascinating is that seems to be the first time Pacific writer has used the dwarf figure. And then later on in Albert Wen's Flying Fox in the Freedom Tree, you see the dwarf. And then to see Tamassese's movie, The Orator, you see the dwarf again. So here are three
It's not a
instances.
stranger to the Pacific.
Yeah, but if
A
I can
small
say,
person that's
yeah, because
powerful.
Marcus was here recently and did this presentation here, and you introduced him. He was going on and on about the dwarf. And I find it fascinating that here are 4 instances of the dwarf figure being deployed to speak back to power. And I do wonder whether Albert Wendt and Tusita Masese were influenced by John's Micheletto Lovelace dwarf figure in his TV episodes.
I don't know, we'd have to ask them. I know that dwarf, though, you know, he did speak back to power, but he was also pretty sassy to, you know, guys like, you know, who was the star of the Wild Wild West, what was his name, James something or other. You know, he'd make these like, put down, he was
Witty, intelligent, and sharp.
yeah, and
crafty.
he used it to put people down too, and you know, I can see John, you know, doing that to people.
As a reflection of self, because he was witty and crafty.
Yeah, when there was
Eloquent.
somebody he didn't like, that's exactly the way he would behave.
But I came up with what you were talking about, right? That business of his foot in both theatrical traditions, right? The dwarf, the little person, is often the jester who speaks truth to
Yeah.
power.
Yeah.
And of course, we saw that with the Benjamin Lay, right? Because he talks literally about meeting up with the monarch and the monarch assuming that what he's there to be is a kind of jester or clown. So he, and John
Game
really.
of Thrones just did it too, hello, right? So that
Oh, yeah,
iconic character is
Yeah,
still.
Mark was talking about
viable.
Peter Dinklage, who's a friend of his, because we had the little person actor here. He was talking about how they were, both of them having to navigate working in the business and what kind of roles they had to take and that kind of thing.
Yeah, it is pretty symbolic of the powerless getting power.
And in a way of closing, do you mind reading that bit about great writers and
That he
living
wrote to
metaphors?
Victoria?
Just a paragraph,
The
about
one
metaphors.
about the metaphors of the dead?
Yeah, I'd love to hear it again.
Yeah, where is that? I think that's.
You know, I just mentioned to Victoria too, and we had our last little rehearsal, and I said, I'm so glad Uncle John was always writing. He used writing to express and to think and to, I have notes all over little pieces of paper and little things, because he was always writing, and I likened him to Queen Liliuokalani. We know so much about her because of her prolific writing. And it was so wonderful to have little tidbits, and when we get together, we have boxes of stuffses. That's all these little things, and some of these things just came up on a little slip of paper, or in something on yellow lined, or school notebook paper, because he decided he'd jot something down. So some of the gems were indeed those little thoughts.
Yeah, so this is, I think this is what you mean, Billy, when he's leaving Hollywood, and he says he couldn't take it anymore, he had to satisfy his own needs, which were, and still are, the voices of my dead. Is that what? I've always thought that the most important thing a writer can do through language is to make new metaphors which serve as new homes for our dead among the living. It was to make such metaphors or find them that I left Hollywood.
And please know that some of the visuals were Dotsy's taking what John said like this and making the visuals. So the Fale'itu one, the covers of the programs, his work inspired her to do it visually as well. So they were a team.
I think that idea though, really, don't you think, is pretty Polynesian though, about, that unconnected voice through families and lineages in Polynesia. It's pretty, and it's hard for me to imagine because, there's our generation that grew up, and John, because he's a totally different generation, he was much closer to a different kind of Samoa than we see today. Too, so.
I'd like to ask you all to join me in